that. And we primarily went through Robert Grier's theorizations of the new novel. Of course, if I had had the time, we could have gone into someone like Natil Sarut. I think I mentioned her, but Sarut's writings on the new novel as well. We could have discussed that, but I don't think we have the time for it. I'm aware of the fact that we should now go to the two novels, looking at the time we have for the rest of this semester. But yeah, and the second class, I think we looked at this particular short story by Alan Robert Grier, The Secret Room, as a kind of demonstration of some of the ideas, though it's not really, it's not a novel, first and foremost, and it's not really a text that has all the sort of distinctive markers or features of the French Nouveau Roman, but I thought I'll give you an idea about the kind of style, at least the kind of style we are talking about. Because as I said, and as I tried emphasizing in those two lectures, this is a very interesting use of description against itself, as it were, because description has always been seen as the most basic mode of realism, realistic description, detailing, and all of that, right? But here we have a certain kind of description which only gets at the surface and not at the depth of things. It approaches the sort of mathematical surface of the object. And by object, we could mean a space as well. This is something that we see a lot in these novels. So that was predominantly, at least the major threads of discussion there. But do you have any questions about that? Yes, Angel.
So about the description itself. So in the lectures you were talking about how description works as a kind of evacuation of meaning. And when we look at the short story, a lot of these characteristics are quite obvious. So like there is no plot and there is no dialogue. Even the linear narrative is interrupted when he talks about the corpse first and then the dying moments. But then because the description is so thick, I just feel like there is some amount of meaning that still comes out of it. Like it's not quite very surface level. So how does something like evacuation of meaning as an objective description as evacuation of meaning work in such a short story?
That's a good question. So evacuation of meaning is, I suppose, an agenda, right? It's like a point that many of these writers are moving towards, or trying at least to move towards. But as you rightly pointed out, it is actually very difficult to write a text which just exists and does not have any meaning. This is almost a utopian notion of literature that exists without making any meaning. But I suppose the agenda there is so there's Satya, I think you can mute yourself, or Parul, if you can mute her, I'm not sure. I don't think I can, but yeah, okay. And there are two profiles, Satya, so maybe you could disappear from one and appear from the other. Anyway, yeah, so to come back to what you were asking, Angel, yeah, I think it's true, as you said, that it's not an absolutely meaningless text. And it's almost impossible to produce an absolutely meaningless text. But I suppose one of the things that the story does is to, at least evacuate the meaning from a very expected genre, let's say. Because the story has the makings of a thriller or a whodunit or a murder narrative, so to speak. But then it eventually seems to become the description of a canvas, right? A painting. So that way, what we have here is in a certain sense, a very typical trope where something that was considered reality at the end is revealed to be an aesthetic representation of reality and not the reality itself. So there's a certain distancing of reality through a very self-reflexive act of representation. And I'm saying representation because at the end of the story, we realize that it was describing a painting, possibly, or someone looking at a painting, someone perhaps internalizing a painting, which is why there's a certain movement, because, of course, a painting actually does not have or cannot have movement in it, even though it may depict movement, or there could be a series of paintings. Anyway, but you're right that it's not absolutely meaningless. And I think it is not possible to produce a literary text which is absolutely meaningless. But at the same time, the idea here is to write against a certain idea of meaning, right? Which is not necessarily, heading towards absolute meaninglessness. One could even say that that's not necessarily the point, because the point is to evacuate, let's say, psychological meaning, not all meaning whatsoever. But having said that, it is true, and I think I made that point in the talk as well, in the lectures as well, that there is at least an inclination in a lot of these experimental modernist literature to attack the very process of meaning making. This attack on meaning making is something that we will see in Gertrude Stein as well. We'll start talking about her later on, later today. But anyway, there is an attempt to subvert meaning, but the attempt to subvert meaning does not and cannot produce complete meaninglessness. What it produces is, let's say, a frustrated process of meaning making. As a reader, sometimes these texts are difficult to read precisely because they will create certain expectations for you, and then they will thwart those expectations. You will be expecting something and you'll not get it, or you'll get a half knowledge about something, not a complete, clarity on things. Does that at least partially respond to your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? About the secret room, or more generally about French Nouveau Roman? I think I also highlighted this, but it's important to again see the connections here between cinema and literature. Robert Greer talks about cinema in Notes to the New Novel, in the essays that we read or read through. He thinks that cinema has a particular kind of a manipulation of the object, which is slightly different from the novelistic manipulation, because the traditional novelistic manipulation creates all these psychological subjective meanings for the object, whereas cinema can sometimes just show the object without necessarily imputing meaning on it. And this question of the interface between cinema and literature is something that is always there. Robert Greer was a director. In fact, he made films, and as we were saying, even before that, when we were talking about Oulipo, someone like Perec was also very interested in films. He acted in films, he directed films. So what we see very clearly, and even in surrealism, we have Buñuel, we have Dali getting interested in filmmaking. So there's a lot of crisscross happening between literature and cinema, just to sort of flag that point. Okay, yes, is there another question? Yes, Uzma, go ahead.
Sir, I have a very general question. What is the idea behind de-emphasizing the importance of meaning? Is it
Say that again?
because
I can't hear you very well.
Am I audible now?
Yes, go ahead.
So I have a very general question. What is the idea behind de-emphasizing the importance of meaning? Is it just because we want to approach the object from a different perspective, or something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so some of it has to do with inventing new forms, and there's and also going against realism. Realism is considered this, let's say, this consecration of meaning. Realism is like almost like a temple of meaning, right? So going against meaning making as a process is partially avant-gardist, partially an attempt to make or create a new form, which is again one of those characteristic things with modernism, as we've talked about. But it's also about, again, and that's something that we would see a lot more with the two writers we will read after this, Stein and Beckett. There's also an attempt to attack language as the medium of expression. So when I say attacking the process of meaning making, it is also about attacking language. Now, why do you attack language? You attack language to make up a new language, to construct a new language, not to necessarily absolutely get rid of language, because it's difficult. Again, I mean, people like Beckett, and you read a letter to kind of initiate this conversation. That's my plan, at least for later today. Let's see how much we can do. But anyway, there is an attempt to, of course, exhaust language as a medium of representation, but there's also an attempt, ironically, to make up a new language. As we have said, I mean, all these attacks on realism are again producing another kind of realism. It's not that they are not producing any kind of realism. I mean, this is something that Robert Gray is also partially aware of. The other possibility of attacking the process of meaning making is also another way of thinking about this is to think about it in a political way, where a lot of these writers are going against a particular ideological construction of meaning in literary texts. It could be ideological meaning in the sense of, again, going back to Zola, the kind of social or political, to use a very crude word, messaging that happens in literature, or the kind of social or political positions that the writer can take, the characters can take, the writer can make the characters take, right? So again, loosely, this is what Zola was calling experiment, right? That the writer takes the character through all these weird situations, and there's a certain educative value in that journey, right? Social political journey. So in that sense, the attempt to, let's say, deconstruct meaning, or to deconstruct the dominant ideological meanings is also a political project. At least for some modernist writers, it is a political project. And even now, I mean, if you think of the whole idea of innovation or creating something anew, there is a certain politics of novelty there, right? So one could think of it again as a subversion of dominant ideological structures of meaning, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, sir. It does.
Thank you. Satya, were you trying to say something? I think there was a lot of interference and noise. I couldn't hear.
Yeah, I was trying to say. Hello.
I can't hear you very well. Can you speak a touch louder, please?
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, sir. Can you repeat? I am today. I don't know. My device is not working.
Oh, no
That's
problem. What I was saying is, I mean, are you? Do you think you'll be able to hand in the second assignment anytime soon?
Yes.
I thought, yeah.
Yeah. I'm submitting today that one.
Okay. Yeah, because I thought we were talking about 10 a.m. in the morning, but anyway, because I didn't get yours, I thought I'll just talk to you because you're here. Okay, fine. Thank you. Right. Any other question on French new novel? Okay, just give me 1 minute. I need to get some. Sorry. Let me start sharing the screen. So I wanted to begin talking about Gertrude's Time today. We'll not necessarily read Lucy Church amiably today, but I at least wanted to start talking about her generally and her works. But before I do that, I thought I'll mention a particular letter by Samuel Beckett to one of his friends, Kaun. It's a letter originally written in German. We'll read it in English translation. The letter mentions Gertrude Stein, and because the two writers we'll be reading from now on, one is Gertrude Stein, the other is Samuel Beckett, I thought this is a good letter to sort of begin talking about some of the concerns, because the shared concern that both of them have, of course, they do it in very different ways, as we would see with, Lucy Church Amiably, a 1930 novel, and the mode in which it is written, and the kind of novel we see in The Unnameable, right, which is written in the 50s. So anyway, they're located in two different time zones, so to speak. But having said that, it is true that there is a certain concern that binds them, or there's a certain concern that connects these two writers. And that concern is this idea of attacking language or going against language. And this is something that a young Beckett, in this particular letter from 1937, he's just 31 at this point, this is what Beckett is talking about. And we'll just read parts of this letter. It's a very famous letter, which is sometimes discussed in discussions of modernism generally. So let me just share my screen, just 1 second. Yeah. An overnight flight, so you might witness some stream of consciousness. I hope I don't babble too much. Okay, right. Hopefully this is visible to everyone. This is the letter in English translation. We are reading from the first volume of Beckett's letters. I'll make this part available. As you can see, it's dated 9 July 1937. And Beckett is writing to his friend, Kaun. We'll read a part of this letter, not the entire thing. Now, this is where we start reading the letter. It is indeed getting more and more difficult, even pointless for me, to write in formal English. And more my language appears to me like a veil, which one has to tear apart in order to get to those things or the nothingness lying behind it. Grammar and style, to me, they seem to have become as irrelevant as a Bedemar bathing suit or the imperturbability of a gentleman, a mask. It is to be hoped the time will come, thank God, in some circles it already has, when language is best used where it is most efficiently abused. Since we cannot dismiss it all at once, at least we do not want to leave anything undone that may contribute to its disrepute, to drill one hole after another into it until that which lurks behind, be it something or nothing, starts seeping through. I cannot imagine a higher goal for today's writer. This is a very famous paragraph. Again, I mean, it has the typical sort of Beckettian wit, the early Beckett kind of wit, which is very Swiftian, reminds us of Jonathan Swift, the satirist. But the important point here is that language, this is the point, language is best used where it is most efficiently abused. Because we cannot get rid of language altogether, at least we have to contribute to its disrepute. This is what he considers to be the greatest or the highest goal of the writer of 1930, let's say, today's writer, as he says. So there is perhaps something behind language or nothing, but this conceptualization of language as a veil is important. Language is like a veil, and you have to cut through it. You have to tear it apart. You cannot use it to garnish your work. You have to smash it, smash the representational mirror of language. Of course, there is a certain personal context here. This is the time when Beckett is slowly shifting to French. He cannot write in English. He doesn't want to write in English anymore, as it were. But so it begins with that particular sort of specificity of English language, but then it goes into a more general and a more ontological claim about language, that language hides being. And that's why I say it ontological. Language hides being. Language is like a mask for the being. And if you really have to get at the thing or the nothing that lies behind language, you have to tear it apart. It's like a mask which has to be torn apart. And this is the role of the writer. Also mark this interesting metaphor to drill one hole after another into it, right? Like a sculptor's metaphor. It's a sculptural metaphor, as it were. To drill one hole after another, or a masonry. It's a work of masonry, as it were. So a sculptor would sometimes have to drill holes. A mason almost always drills holes. So you have to create these holes or punch these holes on the surface of language. Okay. But he goes on. Or is literature alone to be left behind on that old foul road long ago abandoned by music and painting? Is there something paralyzingly sacred contained within the unnature of the word that does not belong to the elements of the other arts? Is there any reason why that terrifyingly arbitrary materiality of the word's surface should not be dissolved? As, for example, the sound surface of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony is devoured by huge black pauses, so that for pages on end, we cannot perceive it as other than a dizzying path of sounds connecting unfathomable chasms of silence. An answer is requested. What is interesting about this paragraph is that Beckett is talking about other arts, right? Music, painting, and he's saying literature, has to connect or has to advance itself just as music has, just as painting has. Why would literature be far behind? What is so sacred about language? So this idea of language being something sacred is, of course, the whole notion of logocentrism. For some of you, this might be a new word. Logocentrism simply refers to a traditional philosophical idea where you think logos is central to everything. And logos is not just reason, logos is also a reason-driven language, right? So sacralizing language is a religious act. In fact, this whole idea of textual studies, largely speaking in the West, began from the interpretations of the Bible. And Bible was taken as this sacred text to be interpreted ad infinitum, as it were, right? So, and this is an argument that Franco Moretti and others have made sometimes a little more critically, that close reading is almost like a church. Close reading is like a religious act, because this whole idea of paying the closest possible attention to the text comes from the tradition of sacred texts, the Bible, for example. But anyway, the idea is that we have to desacralize language, not sacralize it. What is so sacred about language? That's what he's saying, right? Is there something paralyzingly sacred? Why is it paralyzing? Because it does not allow us to make that experiment. If I think language is sacrosanct, I will not be able to drill those holes into onto the surface of language, right? And as an example, he cites the Seventh Symphony of Beethoven. Some of you, I'm sure, would have already heard it. If you notice, as it goes on, especially after around the 10th, 12th minute, there are these regular intervals where you have seconds of silence. Silence reigns for 10 seconds. And again, the symphony starts. So that's what Beckett calls these huge black pauses, right? So he's sort of talking about a music or a musical soundscape that produces these hollows or these holes. If that can be done in music, Why can it not be done in literature? That's what he's saying, right? I know there are people, sensitive and intelligent people, for whom there is no lack of silence. I cannot help but assume that they are hard of hearing. For in the forest of symbols that are no symbols, the birds of interpretation, that is no interpretation, are never silent. So he's arguing for a literature of silence, something like, someone like Ihab Hassan. I think I've mentioned him earlier as one of the first postmodern theorists. Ihab Hassan wrote an early book called Literature of Silence, and he included the likes of Beckett in that study. So in this famous letter, he's sort of moving towards a literature of silence, something that he would later call a literature of unword or non-word, a literature of silence. So even though, of course, for a lot of sensitive people, there is no lack of silence, as he says, there's too much of this hermeneutic drive. So that's the problem. The hermeneutic drive, you're always trying to interpret, even when there is nothing to interpret. You're trying to come up with a symbol where there is no symbol. That is what creates the chatter that makes silence impossible. As opposed to that chatter, he's talking about a literature which can produce silence. It's a paradox, of course, because literature is a linguistic act, and at some level, literature breaks silence. But then he's talking about a literature that will not just break silence, but will also make or create a kind of silence, generate a kind of silence. Okay. And here we go on with this. Of course, for the time being, one makes do with little. At first, it can only be a matter of somehow inventing a method of verbally demonstrating this scornful attitude vis-a-vis the world. In this dissonance of instrument and usage, perhaps one will already be able to sense a whispering of the end music or of the silence underlying all. The silence underlying all is the silence of death. But what is this dissonance? The dissonance is between the instrument of literature, language, and the usage of language. So it's an anti-linguistic use of language. You cannot write literature without language, at least not entirely. Some form of language would have to be there. So there's a dissonance here between the instrument of literature and its usage. And it might produce that sense of silence. That's what he's saying. In my opinion, the most recent work of Joyce, and he's referring to Finnegan's Wake here, had nothing at all to do with such a program. There, it seems much more a matter of an apotheosis of the word. Again, mark the religious word, apotheosis. Again, apotheosis of the word is a sacralization of language. Unless ascent into heaven and descent into hell are one and the same. How nice it would be to be able to believe that in fact it were so. For the moment, however, we will limit ourselves to the intention. So he's separating this project of abusing language, attacking language from Joyce's the then current work, Finnegan's Wake. He's not saying that Joyce is not interesting enough. He's just differentiating his own project from Joyce's. And this is very typical, right? A writer has to come out of another writer's shadow as well, even though, of course, Beckett almost always, until Joyce's death, until his own death, maintained a certain degree of loyalty towards Joyce. Having said that, or Joyce was always his hero, so to speak, in spite of that, he wouldn't want to repeat Joyce. And of course, Beckett wouldn't have been Beckett if he had repeated Joyce. I don't think he would have been given as much importance if he had just repeated another great writer. So one writer always has to depart from another writer. That's a general point. Finally, we come to Gertrude Stein here. This will be my segue after this. We'll talk very briefly about Gertrude Stein before we end today. Perhaps Gertrude Stein's logographs come closer to what I mean. The fabric of the language has at least become porous, if regrettably only quite by accident, and as it were, as a consequence of a procedure somewhat akin to the technique of Fenninger. Fenninger is a famous expressionist painter. The unhappy lady, is she still alive, is undoubtedly still in love with her vehicle, if only, however, as a mathematician is with his numbers. For him, the solution of the problem is of very secondary interest. Yes, as the death of numbers, it must seem to him indeed dreadful. So, just as the lady would be unhappy about the death of the lover, the mathematician will be devastated by even the thought of the death of numbers. What if there were no numbers? What would that mean for a mathematician? But it's interesting that he uses this term logographs. Gertrude Stein does not have a work that is literally titled logograph. So Beckett is not talking about one particular work of Gertrude Stein's. He's talking about her work generally as this, abuse of language, word smashing in the name of beauty, as he would say later on in this letter. The fabric of the language has become porous in Gertrude Stein's work. How and what is this porous language? We will see very soon. And then he goes into this contradiction between nominalism and realism. I won't go into that to take us far afield. But is there one? Yeah. So there's this reference to mathematics or mathematicians is also interesting because, again, we have seen already with Oulipo, and in a very different, say, in a more muted sense, even with French Nouveau Roman, that mathematics is almost always a reference point. And Beckett was, someone who knew both the Oulipians and the Nouveau Romanciers very well, right? As I think showed you a picture of his with the Nouveau Romanciers in one of the lectures. So anyway, this constant referencing of mathematics is interesting. And it comes to this point, which is very Oulipian here. He talks about this crazy mathematician. It's almost a mythical mathematician he's talking about, but we've all heard stories like this about mathematicians who used to apply a new principle of measurement at each individual step of the calculation. And then he says, word storming in the name of beauty, as I said, word storming or word smashing in the name of beauty. So the experimental process of hitting out at language, attacking language, is still an aesthetic process. But of course, there's a degree of irony in this sentence, word storming in the name of beauty, right? It's a counter-aesthetic process, but not a completely anti-aesthetic process, right? The slant on experiment becomes all the more obvious in this reference to the crazy mathematician. Why? Because what is this mathematician doing? He's trying to solve a particular problem in maths, but each step that he's doing, let's say on the blackboard or on the whiteboard, he's doing each step in a different way, in a different technique, in a new principle of measurement. So that's an experiment, right? But it's also a potentially anarchist experiment. You may never be able to solve the problem if you do each step in a new principle of measurement, right? Right, and then he talks about this foreign language and the fact that he has been trying to do this by shifting to French language, but he wants to do this against his own language as well, which is English, but also a very highly Irish inflected English, with touches of Gaelic and so on. So this is what I wanted to read from the letter to give you an idea about what we are talking about in terms of this sort of critical attitude towards language as a representational medium, this attack on language as a representational medium. But for the remainder of this lecture, I'll just talk about Gertrude Stein in a more general way, just giving you some biographical pointers as well, a general idea of her corpus, before we start talking about Lucy Church amiably from the next class. Now, she's an American writer. Even her grave mentions she's an American writer, even though for almost the entirety of her writing life, she was in France. But interestingly, even though she knew French very well, she never decided to write in French, unlike Beckett. So Beckett would write in both French and English. At one point, he would switch to French. Someone like Stein never did that. She always wrote in English. There are some works in French, but very, very few. She's actually quite a prolific writer, which is quite often not noticed enough because these are very uneven and very peculiar works. Some of them are sketches, some of them are novels, some of them are poems. There are also, things that look like reports or even, description of food, something that resembles a cookbook, something like that. Her dates are 1874 to 1946. She was born in America. She was born in Pennsylvania, in fact, in Pittsburgh. But as I said, most of her life was spent in France. She moved to Paris in 1903, in the very beginning of the 20th century. And as you can understand, this is a Paris full of all these, avant-garde writers. Picasso was there at that point. Fitzgerald was there. Ezra Pound, of course, was there. Matisse was there. And she was an art collector. This is an important point to keep in mind. She was an art collector. And that's how she came to know all these famous painters, especially Picasso, as I said, was one of her closest friends. She was also very good friends with Ernest Hemingway, who was also in France at this point, right? Ernest Hemingway, the famous American novelist, was in France at this point, and Gertrude Stein was a friend of his. Her younger brother was also an artist or wanted to become an artist. So this was a very calculated move on her part when she wanted to move to Paris in 1903. So as you can understand, she's not even 30 when she reaches Paris. And from there, for the next 43 years, that's where she works, that's where she lives, that's where she writes. So one could, again, make an interesting case about transnational modernism here. We have an American writer who shifts to France, never writes in French, and yet is steeped in French culture, French literature, French art scene, and produces these, almost French novels in English, right? Now, when it comes to Gertrude Stein, of course, there are many things that are interesting about her. Let me just, give a very quick overview. Like Juna Barnes, whom I mentioned earlier, she's an important writer for various reasons, of course. But one important reason is that she's also, like Juna Barnes, a lesbian writer to emerge from the modernist, canon, so to speak, right? So again, Gertrude, unlike Juna Barnes, who had a series of muses and not so many long-standing relationships, though she was always melancholic and sad about not having those long-standing relationships. Unlike that, Gertrude Stein had a lifelong partner in the name of Alice B. Toklas, Toklas, Alice B. Toklas. And in fact, her first major work that really catapulted her to to great fame is a very strange book. It's called The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, who's her partner, but it's actually her life story, as in it is Gertrude Stein's life story in the name or in the voice, one could say, in the narrative voice of Alice B. Toklas. Okay? So again, there's a whole discussion to be had, I suppose, about these hidden autobiographies, which are not exactly autobiographies, but autobiographies written through the voice of the other. This was a trend in modernism. Someone like Thomas Mann would often do that. Robert Musil would often do that, especially the German. I'm talking about the German strand here. The German modernists, like the two major German modernists are Thomas Mann and Robert Musil. So they both would do that. Just an aside, I think maybe last month this book was published. I haven't yet read it, but I'm pretty sure it should be good. The Magician is a novel which has been published on the life of Thomas Mann. So I think again, I'll definitely recommend that. He's again a very important writer when we're talking about the German side of modernism that we haven't touched to that extent. Anyway, we can come back to this later on. I just wanted to mention The Magician, which is a kind of a novelistic reconstruction of Thomas Mann's late years, especially. Anyway, okay. So this particular book in 1933 really made Gertrude Stein famous, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. We are talking about a novel, Lucy Church, which predates this novel or this autobiography that made her famous. So we're talking about an early text, a relatively early text. So it's not really early. I mean, by that point, she's already written at least three major works. One is Three Lives, which was written in 1905, published around the same time, 5-6. The Making of Americans, which was written over a long period of time, almost for a decade. And perhaps her most well-known work, Tender Buttons, in 1914. Okay, so Three Lives, The Making of Americans, and Tender Buttons. All these were written before Lucy Church Amiably, but Lucy Church Amiably was written before the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, right? So I'm just trying to give you a general idea of her corpus. It's a huge corpus and we can't possibly talk about everything. One interesting detail is that she was a student of medicine, but she left in the middle of it. I mean, she didn't find enough interest in that program, but she did enroll herself to the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. As I said, in terms of her love life, almost all her life, she was very, very close to Alice B. Toklas, and they lived together. Of course, at that point, we're talking about a time when no legal recognition could at all be possible of any lesbian relationship. So, after she passed away much before Alice. Anyway, Alice was finally buried alongside her after another 20 years or so when she died. Alice, again, interestingly, wrote a cookbook, which mentions, of course, Gertrude Stein, which is a very weird kind of a cookbook come memoir kind of a work, right? And if you read Tender Buttons, which is a very peculiar book, again, between prose and poetry, as it were, a bit like Rabindranath Tagore's Lipika, which I mentioned earlier as a sort of modernist text. So again, Tender Buttons has a section devoted to food. And we will see this when we read Lucy Church. There's a lot of food reference in Gertrude Stein. And it's interesting that Alice B. Toklas would write a cookbook and use that as almost a memorial book for her partner, Gertrude Stein. Now, Gertrude Stein's politics has been under a lot of critical discussion. I think we should mention this. It's very interesting because on the one hand, she's a Jewish lesbian writer writing in the early 20th century France. She literally sees the war, the Germany occupied France, and then she lives through one of the most horrendous historical periods, so to speak, the Vichy government, right? The Vichy government, which is the post-war government. It was named after the leader, of course. So that's usually how we refer to that particular period, especially the period from around 1940 to around 1944, the Vichy regime. Now, the Vichy regime is famous for its anti-Semitism and its, anti-Jewish agenda. There's a clear kind of line of dissent from Hitler. And in that particular regime, it's very surprising, almost bewildering, that someone like Gertrude Stein would actually show a certain inclination towards right-wing fascism. Right? She came out in direct sort of support of a leader of that particular government, Marshal Pétain. Okay, and she was called a Pétainist, or because She was also interested in translating Pétain's political speeches from French to English. She was interested in having that kind of strong leadership in America, right? So it's very interesting. Again, we've discussed this earlier, how many of the modernist writers show a certain inclination towards right-wing politics. It's a very difficult narrative to conclude, and I don't want to conclude this. It's difficult to say that her work is fascist, because it's not. But having said that, we have to keep this context in mind. The fact that, you know, she was friends. So to go by the historical narrative, she had a friend who was a Nazi supporter or a Nazi collaborator, Bernard Fay. And through Bernard Fay, after the end of the war, she got introduced to Pétain. And that's how this whole, thing came about. Of course, there's been a certain, let's say, justificatory position taken up by some Gertrude Stein critics that, oh, because she was Jewish, because she was lesbian, she had all these minority identities, and she was living in this very trenchant, regime, famous for its draconian laws that went against anything non-French, for example. Derrida writes beautifully about the oppressions of the Vichy government, for example, and his own embattled relation with the French language. He was again from Algeria and a Jewish person, right? So, some critics have tried to justify Gertrude Stein by, making this recourse to her minority identity, that there's a possibility that she had to possibly, let's say, sort of, just to make herself safe, she had to take those positions. I mean, let's not get into that discussion, because it's difficult to do a personal justification or, a personal vilification. Both are somewhat tepid, to be honest. We will see the work that we read and see what kind of politics it may or may not have. She's not an explicitly political writer, but having said that, she did have this sort of flirtation with fascism. She was not, a supporter of Mussolini or, the way, let's say, someone like Kaun was consistently, but she did have quite a strong, sympathy or empathy, whatever you want to call it, for the Vichy government officials and this sort of, Nazi politics, as it were. Not for its anti-Semitism, of course, because she herself, being a Jewish, that would be weird. But I think this is a question maybe one of you had already asked earlier in one of the classes. One of the reasons why one would like to think that a lot of these modernist writers became a bit enamored of this strong right-wing politics is essentially this leadership cult, this cult of leadership. And we see this in contemporary India, we see this everywhere, this very strong, hyper-masculine cult of leadership, which attracts a lot of people. We can remember that famous play by Eugene Ionesco, The Rhinoceros, right? Where every human being is turning into a rhinoceros, and Berenger, the protagonist, is trying to fight this rhinoceritis, or this, conversion into rhinoceros. Of course, it's a bizarre play, it's an absurdist play and all of that. But having said that, it is usually read as an allegory of fascism and an allegory of the very attraction of fascism. They have the same root, right? Fascination and fascism, the two words have the same root. Fascism could be fascinating to a lot of people, could sort of suck people in, as it were, like a crocodile's mouth. So the attraction of a very strong, let's say, high-minded or high-handed, I should say, leadership is something that drew a lot of people to this politics. That's at least one way of explaining the sort of penchant for, let's say, right-wing politics in a lot of these writers. Right? Let me just check my notes to see if there's anything else I wanted to mention. No, I think we're more or less done for today. Do you have any questions so far about Gertrude Stein. So what we'll do from day after tomorrow is we'll start reading the novel. Let me say this right ahead. Before, I don't know, some of you might have already started reading it. If you haven't, it's not a very easy novel. And she's a nonsense writer. She's someone who is very fond of nonsense verses, nonsense literature in general. That's another unique thing about Gertrude Stein, I should mention at the end, that she's one of the, perhaps the only modernist writer who very seriously engages in nonsense. You know, because modernists usually do not engage in nonsense literature. Even when they do comedy, the comedy is much more dry. It's not nonsense literature. This is a peculiar novel, as we would see. It's a pastoral romance, but it's written in a very gawky, peculiar kind of language, full of repetitions, full of absurdities. There is no plot or hardly any, even though you can see the semblance of almost a classic Dickensian, well-constructed novel here. But it's like it has all the promise of a well-constructed novel, and then it messes up. It smudges that entire paradigm of the well-made novel, right? So it's a peculiar novel on many accounts because it's a nonsense novel. It's at one level, it's a feminist novel. It's a novel that talks about pastoralism, which is hardly a point of discussion in modernism, usually at least. And it has this very peculiar function of logography, as you know, to take after Beckett, if we use that word like Beckett does, logograph. There's a certain element of logography or a certain element of word smashing in the name of beauty. And that is something that we would see. So again, when we read the novel, when you read the novel, what I would like you to do before the next class, once you are reading the novel, is not to pay attention too much to this question, what does it mean? Don't think too much about what does it mean. Just try and read through it and spot the major tropes, spot the major themes, without necessarily trying to understand what the sentence would mean. Because Stein is not a writer who can be understood at the sentence level. Very often, you will not understand anything. I also don't understand anything. So we'll be talking about what we don't understand from the next class onwards. But I think it will be an exciting journey. This is also the first time I'm teaching Gertrude Stein, so I'm pretty excited about this. For all these years of leading her, I'm teaching her for the first time, and it's always a closer reading and a more menacing reading because you have to find out things to talk about. Anyway, there are lots of things to talk about in Lucy Church Amiably. So we'll start with Lucy Church Amiably, at least the prologue. You know, we'll have to, I'll have to make sure we cover a certain portion. So I think we'll at least try to finish the prologue to the novel before the actual novel begins, the first 40 pages or so, right? The novel anyway is there in your folder. I'll make a post after this class to sort of, you know, give you the directions there. You already have access to it. So I think it's a good idea to start reading it before the first class, which will be day after tomorrow, right? Day after tomorrow at 2. Okay, questions? Otherwise, we are done. No questions? I guess once we read the novel, there'll be more questions. I will make this letter available so that you can, you know, sort of read it again. I think it's a very important letter, the letter that we read today by Beckett. It's almost like a manifesto for a certain kind of late modernism that we see in both Beckett and Stein in very different ways. They're two very different writers, but they do share this, you know, this idea of logography, or this idea of, you know, attacking language, deconstructing it. We would see how Stein does it primarily through nonsense. And what are the tropes in that nonsense we'll discover as we go along. Okay, perfect. So I'll